Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Dopplereffekt, Neurotelepathy. Dopplereffekt is a Detroit Techno outfit masterminded by Gerald Donald in collaboration with his wife, Michaela Tonon-Bertel, sorry for butchered pronunciation as per usual, occasionally also featuring a few other people depending on the project, like Kim Carley or William Scott. They've been at it since the mid-90s. This is technically only their fourth studio album to date, but they also have a number of EPs and are probably best known for their Gesamtkunstwerk compilation from 1999. Lots of people have asked me to do a deeper dive on the work of Gerald Donald over the years, since while Dopplereffekt is the most consistently active of the various projects he's been involved with, it's not the most famous of them. You may primarily know him as one half of the legendary Detroit Techno outfit Drexciya, alongside James Stinson. Donald has also started a load of other projects outside of that, which have all seen some level of critical acclaim, such as Zyklus, Arpanet, Japanese Telecom, among others. Once I saw this project randomly show up on the new music section of iTunes, I immediately felt like I had to do my due diligence and cover it. But given how broken up Donald's work is over so many different projects and names, I wasn't really sure how to tackle it in a brief segment. Just talking about the Dopplereffekt albums wouldn't feel like it'd do his work justice. So I'll tell you what, I'm also gonna stuff in the albums he's worked on under those other four names I mentioned. Getting any proper full-length release from Gerald Donald is a rare occurrence in this day and age, and James Stinson unfortunately passed away in 2002, which means I can't exactly wait around for a new Drexciya album to come out for the opportunity to talk about them, so to heck with it, I'll go through all those too. This is absolutely not going to be comprehensive, but here's my thoughts on a pretty decent chunk of the Gerald Donald discography so far. So let's start by talking about the most famous project that Gerald Donald's been involved in, Drexciya. The project that first got me into this duo back in my early college days was this double disc compilation from 1997 here, The Quest, which delivers so many great retro techno grooves and classic TR-808 drum machine beats and plenty of variety from darker and more aggressive material to much smoother melodic stuff. I never feel like it gets boring over 2 hours, and it all adds up to their cohesive concept about some secret underwater race and their futuristic society. This is the kind of stuff I think of when I think Detroit Techno. Perhaps unfortunately this comp is not currently available for legal streaming, only unofficial uploads on YouTube, but the vast majority of the material on here was re-released on a series of 4 EPs called Journey of the Deep Sea Dweller, if you're interested. Now if you want a less ridiculously sprawling introduction to Drexciya, well, this classic debut album from 1999 is pretty damn long too, but at least it's only 1 CD. I'll admit that when I first heard this project many years ago, I didn't think it was anything special in the grander scheme of this genre, but it has slowly grown on me over time, and now listening to the full expanded 21-track version recently, I might even like that a little more than The Quest now. It has just as much variety and happens to be catchier, more accessible, and melody-centric. Of course, it features lots of their most easily recognizable tracks, like Surface Terrestrial Colonization, C to the Power of X, and their big signature track, Andrean Sand Dunes. Probably the project I'd most recommend for a starting point to get into them. This album I remember not caring for much at all when I first heard it, but coming back to it, well, okay, I can kind of see why it wasn't my thing back then, but I definitely have more of an appreciation for it now. It's certainly much darker than Neptune's Lair, much less melody and more focus on the robotic percussion patterns. And while I don't enjoy it more, I can see how that much more foreboding feel would appeal more to other people. And this one I didn't even hear at all back in the day. There wasn't an easy way to listen to it at the time I first got into them. Shame, because, surprise, it is also quite good. Resembles the dark and metallic sounds of Harness the Storm more than anything else, but takes it into much spacier and slightly weirder and more experimental territory. Makes for a surprisingly solid send-off to the band, I would say. Now, in terms of Gerald Donald's solo work without any collaboration, the first alias I have to note is Japanese Telecom, under which he released 2 albums and then never touched again. But I do need to bring this alias up in particular because this self-titled album from 1999 was actually my first exposure to Donald's work at all, well before I even knew about Drexciya or anything else he'd done. I discovered the track Character Maps through an old iTunes Essentials playlist, and I thought it was a bop. The album itself is super short, just 20 minutes, and sometimes even classified as an EP, depending on who you ask. But, not gonna lie, I think this is legit great. This brought back some good memories, lots of fun and playful little electro bangers, and still feels like a complete album statement, despite the length. This totally holds up for me. The other Japanese Telecom album I heard around the same time, and didn't stick with me nearly as much. It's definitely more of an album than the self-titled, and coming back to it, I still got all the same playful vibes and old-school electro bangers. It's just less catchy or memorable. The other big solo alias Donald has is Arpanet, which he's kept more consistently active, but only released 3 full albums under. This was the only one I'd heard before doing this whole marathon, a concept record literally about the advent of wireless internet, which is pretty strange to hear 20 years later, now that such technology is so ubiquitous and commonplace, very much in the same way as Kraftwerk's Computer World, which this album is even more blatantly indebted to than usual. In the best way, mind you. It's another quality electro record like the Japanese Telecom ones, but obviously taking itself much more seriously. It is very good. Meanwhile, this one went in a way more abstract and experimental direction. A lot of formless short-form compositions, strange, chilling, amelodic synth effects, and more brittle techno grooves prone to abruptly falling apart in a heap. Production's a lot more modern sounding and well polished, too. Many parts give me, like, Audiker vibes, circa Quarestis, but combined with just enough of the usual electro sound he's known for to still be recognizable. I thought it was pretty dang cool, personally. And this one kinda sits in between the styles of the other two, focusing more on standard electro and techno grooves like on wireless internet, but with the more polished and darker sounding production style as explored on Quantum Transposition. Oh, and there's more vocals. Donald actually sings on a few tracks. And I enjoyed it about as equally as I enjoyed the other 2 Arpanet albums. It's good. One more alias I want to touch on before actually getting into Dopplereffekt is Der Zyklus, which I think started out as a Gerald Donald solo venture and is primarily known for this one album, but has a number of other releases which I believe are collaborations with people he worked on in Dopplereffekt. Anyway, this album is one of the more minimalistic and experimental-leaning projects in this marathon. These compositions are all very tightly structured, but they focus on creepier and less melodic sounds, and there's not much in the way of beat work. It both sounds like many different of these releases I've talked about, but also unlike any of them. It's quite interesting. There was apparently one other proper Der Zyklus album here, but not only is it only 6 tracks at 20 minutes, it's super rare, and the only way I could hear it was through an unofficial YouTube upload. By my ears, it's pretty much more of the same kind of stuff as seen on Biometry, a bit more simplistic and ambient-centric, maybe even the tiniest bit more accessible, but aesthetically still the same. I thought it was cool. And of course I'll finish with the material actually from Dopplereffekt, which is most relevant to this video, and I actually listened to first in this marathon, but whatever. Anyway, this compilation of various early singles and EPs is the most famous project released under the name, and widely considered to be a classic, so of course that's where I started. And it's a weird one. While this comp focuses on all the sounds you'd expect, staying firmly in raw and edgy electro territory with super straightforward drum machine grooves and retro synth melodies, with plenty of classic bangers like Cellular Phone and Infophysics, I was absolutely not prepared for the few moments on here which get really explicit out of nowhere. There's 2 tracks about pornography, one about sterilizing the population, and 2 tracks where Donald expresses his desire to fuck mannequins. Also, not to get into the tracks that have Nazi imagery, like how there's a track called Superior Race, and how a good chunk of the comp takes from their debut EP called Fascist State. I am kind of left not really knowing what to do with the comp as a whole. Like, those edgier moments really threw me off. But I can't deny the historical importance, and all the moments that do still really hold up, and how unmistakable their identity is pinned down from the get-go. I mean, I probably respect this more than I enjoy it, but I can still certainly co-sign it anyway. Now, the debut Dopplereffekt album from 2003 is completely different. It's an almost entirely ambient project based around the concept of quantum mechanics, primarily focused on glitchy, abstract, mostly amelodic mechanical noises and long-form pieces without any defined structure. Well, there are also a few more melodic cuts near the end too, which are really good. But even so, the whole thing ended up surprisingly consistently engaging and cohesive, a fully fleshed out expansion into their scientific approach and themes. I think it's a little better than the similarly quantum-themed Arpanet album too, even if that one was better produced. Well, this has all the spacey atmosphere, the spooky melodies, the polished analog synth sounds, and mechanical textures you'd expect. Though it was also kind of fragmented and scattershot as a whole, with several tracks that feel a bit underdeveloped, and it ends super abruptly. It certainly has its moments, though, especially the 12-minute epic hyperelliptical surfaces and the dramatic non-vanishing harmonic spinor. Album's cool, but not one of my big favorites in this marathon. And this was a comeback for Dopplereffekt, released in 2017, 10 years after the previous one. It's probably the most openly melodic and epic-sounding Dopplereffekt album, almost more Tangerine Dream-ish in moments, but with the stiff and intentionally unpolished retro-futurist sheen that you'd expect. I was ironically kinda left wishing for a few of those weirder moments to break up the sound of this one, like those on Calabiao Space. This could run together a bit, and it's really not among the most memorable stuff I've ever heard in this vein, but I did still enjoy it for what it was anyway. Flows pretty well, for sure. And I'm gonna stop there. I think this segment has gone on plenty long already, but there's plenty of other Gerald Donald related projects I've skipped over, like Electroids, Abstract Thought, Black Replicas, Visionwelt, Glass Domain, Project STS-31, just to name a few. Gerald Donald is one very prolific artist. But that'll take us to this most recent Dopplereffekt project here, Neurotelepathy. I admittedly was primarily excited to cover this because it would provide me an excuse to do that in brief segment, and while I figured this latest album would also provide some quality electro material, I also wouldn't have been super surprised if it turned out not to give me much to discuss. On the other hand, Gerald Donald is also not the kind of artist who likes to repeat himself, so what particular side of his sound he and Tonan would be focusing on here was anyone's guess. After hearing it, I can in fact confirm that it does sound right in line with all the other releases I've talked about in this video, but also sounds like its own thing separate from all of them. And I was also pleasantly surprised to hear that this album does also have enough variety to justify highlighting in its own video. If I'd attempted to talk about an album like Cellular Automata back when it came out, I suspect I'd have quite a bit of difficulty coming up with much to say about it outside of the few sentences I've already given. And okay, it's not like my thoughts on Neurotelepathy are going to be especially complicated either, but there is some solid variety from track to track and a fairly wide breadth of ideas being explored here. Like how the album starts with a completely abstract track, Epigenetic Modulation, that has nothing but whooshing synth effects, beeping noises that sound like a heart monitor or something, processed spoken vocals from Christina Vancel outlining the album's subject matter, and even some more wordless background vocals that have a slight operatic flavor to them. Nothing else on the album sounds remotely like this track, but it definitely gets your attention. It pulled me in pretty quickly. The rest of this album is various electro and ambient synth compositions that vary in energy. In one moment, you can get something like Neural Impulse Actuator Mirror Neuron, a much darker sounding cut with banging techno beats, spooky dissonant synth arpeggios, and bassy pads with even some airy, wordless female vocals for a bit of extra texture. And then see that get contrasted heavily by a track like Visual Cortex, which is much brighter and more melodic and features no beats. Sounds like a cut that could have come from their last album. And the album from there kind of wobbles between those two extremes. On the banger side, there's tracks like the sparse and somewhat awkward but still pretty heavy and satisfying Neuroplasticity, or the fast-paced and frantic Cerebral to Cerebral interface. Both tracks go pretty hard, and they're balanced out with cuts like Cerebral AI Entanglement, which goes for a much more low-key, ambient-centric approach and has a much more immersive build-up as all these little synth stabs echo out over all these airy pad progressions. Or Optogenetics, which has the same mix of airy pads, but with more of a distinct pulse driven by bubbly and bassy synth arpeggios, and has some pretty dramatic chord progressions that maybe seem a little Jean-Michel Jarre inspired, I don't know. Granted, there are a few tracks that don't stick out to me as much. Cerebral Data Download 2100 AD is kind of just the same mix of sounds as Visual Cortex and Optogenetics, but not quite as memorable. Though I suppose there is a bit more of a sense of progression over time with that one. And I'm not sure if the album ends on the strongest of notes either, even if it does still remain in interesting territory, with the sparser IDM beats of transcranial magnetic stimulation going over some lo-fi pads which kind of give me mild Metamatics vibes. And then the closer EEG might have ended up in the sonically harshest territory, what with all these high-pitched squirting percussive scanning noises running through most of it. kind of reminding me of Species of the Pod from Drexciya's Neptune's Lair. That particular timbre of synth effects got a little hard on the ears, even though the synth pads and arpeggios underneath do add some interesting texture on top of it. The entire album is mastered to be pretty loud. Anytime I listen to this album on my laptop, I feel like I have to turn down the volume a decent bit, and then when I open up any YouTube videos, I have to turn it back up. And that is kinda strange, but I guess not a make or break thing, since it's not like I have to adjust the volume a lot throughout the album itself. When it comes to this album as a complete whole, on one hand, I was left feeling like I enjoyed pretty much all of it for what it was. It's yet another solid addition to the Dopplereffekt catalog and the wider universe of Gerald Donald related projects that stands on its own quite well, having its own identity even among all the other similar sounding projects I've talked about earlier in the video. On the other hand, I'm also not sure how frequently I'm going to end up coming back to this in the coming months. I think my feelings on this ended up in the same camp as that last Biosphere album, where I could enjoy all of it in the moment. I don't really have anything major to object to, but just didn't really see myself being in the mood for it all the time. So, yeah. Neurotelepathy is probably not a keeper for me longer term, but I can still absolutely recommend giving it a shot. If you're a fan of some retro synth material and have enjoyed any Gerald Donald or Drexciya related projects in the past, then I think this album will be worth at least one listen. I definitely had fun with it, enough where I can give it a 7.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.